Let's turn our attention. I was watching on YouTube an interview you did with a gentleman sharing some concerns about Pastor Andy Stanley and some of the ways he's going, some of the ways he's thinking and speaking these days. What is it about Andy Stanley that should have our discernment antenna up right now?
Yeah, well, and that last article that I did this interview on, Andy Stanley was widely quoted, and then he came back later to try to soften it. I want to speak to that. But he was widely quoted as saying that Christians should unhitch from the Old Testament. Now, not only widely quoted, but there was a video of his message. And in the message, he said some really wild things about unhitching and how even the New Testament is unhitched from the Old Testament. And the New Testament writers were unhitching the early church from the Jewish thought. And, I mean, it was just weird because those of us that know the Scriptures know that the entire New Testament is Jewish, written by Jewish writers, written to the early church, which for the first several decades was nothing but Jews, until finally Paul started reaching out to the Gentiles. Peter started helping him some, but it took a long time for the early Christian church, which were Jews who were receiving Jesus as their Messiah, finally understood that, look, we've got to reach the whole world. We've got to reach Gentiles, too. They didn't unhitch from their Jewishness. They didn't unhitch from the Old Testament. The Old Testament was the only Bible that the early church had for decades. It wouldn't be for 100 years after the Christ event before the Scriptures were finally beginning to be canonized into what we would now call the New Testament, written by Jews. So for Andy Stanley to say these things was weird and unbiblical and devastating to the entire biblical message. If we unhitch from the Old Testament, well, but the Old Testament explains why we have the New Testament. The Old Testament gave us the prophecies of Messiah, the whole reason why we need Messiah. The Garden of Eden explains everything. And if we unhitch from the Old Testament, we don't even understand why we need salvation. We don't understand anything about the first coming of Jesus Christ, or that the fact that Israel sitting there in the Middle East right now is the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, wherein God said, I will do this to show the world that I am the Lord. So it was just, I mean, it bordered, I use this word very sparingly, but it bordered on heresy and apostasy. Now, Andy came out later and said, well, now what I was trying to do was to tell them that they don't need to live by the legalistic Jewish laws. Okay, if that's what he meant, I agree. Because, for example, we don't sacrifice lambs every day. Why? Because Jesus is the Lamb who takes away the sins of the world. We do not hold people accountable for a particular day of worship. Why? Because Jesus is the Sabbath rest. If you're in Jesus, you are honoring the Sabbath. The whole book of Hebrews that's what it's written about. That's what it says. And we can go on with those kinds of illustrations. So if that's what he was trying to instruct his church, that's the same thing I instruct my church. I get that. The problem is that's not what he said on the video.
Exactly. Carl, we've got about 4 minutes left.
The Satanists wanted to install their own tribute, a pagan idol, on the Capitol grounds right next to the Ten Commandments.
Billions around the planet are witnessing a world in the grasp of sadistic spiritual darkness. This unholy alliance has infected our governments, our religious institutions, and our societies. The world appears to be unraveling. But can the evil behind these dark supernatural forces be defeated? Is everything playing out just as the Bible predicted it will in the final days? At last, you can know the answers to mankind's most urgent questions and learn your destiny among today's events in the new, unprecedented work taking the prophecy world by storm. Gods and Thrones, Nakash, Forgotten Prophecy and the Return of the Elohim by best-selling author, former decorated law enforcement officer, and senior pastor Carl Gallups. This changes everything. Available now wherever fine books are sold.